Well, first, I want to say thank you so much to Peninsula School of Art for inviting me to talk, and I really am excited to share my work with you. What I did to set this up is I've shown some really early work. I'm going all through the years, and so I am showing some things that I guess it's good that some of my students are here because they'll be able to see old things that I made when I was your age. So, all right, to start, my name is Meghan Sullivan, as Crystal said, and I am from Boston, Massachusetts. And it's something that was very important to me and has shaped me quite a bit growing up was the fact that I come from a very large family. This is a picture at my Holy Communion when I was 7. And actually one of my sisters is not in it because she's taking the photo. So there are 6 of us, and then my cousin lived with us. So there were 7 kids, and then my poor parents. And so I am a figurative sculptor, and I found that a couple of things were very influential for me to become a figurative sculptor. And one of those is that I was constantly surrounded by people growing up. This is a drawing I did of us in our van. And the other thing that was very influential for my figurative sculpting is that I grew up in Boston in a, downtown or an area that was, there's a lot of people there. The town I live in currently has the same population. I live in Appleton, Wisconsin. The town I live in currently has the same population as the neighborhood that I'm from in Boston. So it's a big difference that way. So there was always people around growing up, just very crowded house. So I went to Mass College of Art, which is the only public art college in the United States. So it's a state school in Boston. And when I went there, I quickly took a ceramics class my first year of college. And I really fell in love with ceramics. I fell in love with the wheel, and I was making very strange things for a while, just trying to increase my skills as a potter and really push myself to do explorations of different types of materials and different types of firing. So this is work from when I was 19. So it's very old, 19 and 20. And then I was making all this work, but it was, I was just exploring. So it was really early in my career. At the same time when this was happening, one of my sisters got married and my grandmother died. And I just started to feel like the things that I was thinking about, I wanted to show through a different type of creation. Like making pottery just wasn't answering the questions that I wanted to answer. So I started taking pieces that I threw on the wheel and altering them and making these very, very rough figures. And these figures were based on bridesmaids. So I was making these pieces because I was about to be a bridesmaid, and it started making me question, what does it mean to play a role? And so playing a role, being an iconic figure, quote unquote iconic figure, in that a bridesmaid's kind of a trope. And so I was playing with that and kind of really went off on this figurative. I went down the path of figure, and I never looked back. Although I do love throwing on the wheel. I love every aspect of ceramics, really. So when I graduated from undergrad, I spent a year working as a production potter, but then I was awarded a residency. It was an artist in residence at this studio in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is a city that's next to the city of Boston. And I stayed there for 6 years, and I was able to really push both my surface treatments and the figures that and how to build. And I made a lot of different work. 6 years is a very long time to be just working in a studio. I also obviously had other jobs. And I began teaching at the studio. So that really helped me become more of a teacher. So that sister got married, and actually 2 of my sisters got married. So those sisters got married, started having kids. And so I started thinking a lot about fertility. And then in the city of Boston and in Somerville, they have all these little statues of Mary. They're called bathtub Marys because she looks like she's in a bathtub. And actually my parents have one in their backyard as well. And so, if you think about Mary, she can be considered a fertility figure. And so I was basing a lot of the work I was making on ancient fertility figures, but also on this idea of the statue of Mary and the way that the statue is shaped. So I was making these female figures with tiny heads but really wide hips to reference that for a long time when I was in Boston. And then I also started thinking, and then they had those babies, and then I started thinking about how do we become who we become? You know, how are our personalities made? And that's when I really started to think about the fact that, and there's been studies about, you know, what number sibling you are will really influence who you become in this world, how you deal with others. You know, I'm smack dab in the middle of my family. So my dad would always say that I was the peacemaker because I was the one who was trying to like negotiate between sisters and brothers. And when I started hanging out with these babies who were my nephews, I just started to question like, well, what does it mean to have a personality? And how does it just happen? And now my youngest nephew is 17, I think, you know, he was pretty much the same. I mean, he's much more mature now, obviously, but like his personality was pretty evident at a very early age. And I think that that's true for a lot of people. I mean, it seems like your personalities are what they are. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I also started thinking about, and this has been throughout my work, I started thinking about like, what does color make us look for and look at in a piece? And so how I was using like with this double stacked head piece, you know, the blue is supposed to show that they are touching, but also that they are kind of communicating with each other. So after being in the studio for so long and out of school for so long, I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school. And I applied to graduate school, but I did not get in. My work wasn't strong enough. So instead, I did what's called a Post-Baccalaureate, just means after your undergrad. And I ended up going to the University of Florida in Gainesville. I had never lived outside of the city of Boston at that point. I was 27, and I had always lived close to my family in the city. Florida is very different for Boston. I had been to Florida when I was 7, but 20 years later, it was hot, it was humid, it was filled with bugs. You know, it was a rough transition. I mean, I enjoyed my time there, but it was a rough transition. But I also started being pushed in the studio to think about figure and try to make figures that were slightly more anatomically correct. And so I was really trying to make work that was evoking of an idea, but also still had that kind of iconic Catholic imagery of a sort of a saint, like of the Virgin Mary. So mostly all female figures, and most of them based roughly on me, roughly on my experiences, roughly on the idea of being far away from, you know, everybody you know and love. So these pieces got me into graduate school, and I went to Nebraska. So I went Boston, Florida, Nebraska, which is like an important triangle in my life now, because now I've repeated that triangle twice in my life. So when I went to grad school, and if you ever, when you're in grad school, I was there, it was a 3-year program. It's 3 years where you're just making all types of work all the time. When I think about how much I was in my studio, I kind of I'm envious of my past self, because, you know, I had to go to class and I did teach while I was there, but a lot of it was just working in your studio all hours of the night, staying up all night firing kilns. You know, I remember biking home when the birds were chirping because I had been firing kilns all night, and it's exhausting, but it's really fun as well. So these figures, the conjoined pieces, are both life-size figures, which was really hard to get in and out of my studio and in and out of the kiln. They actually were built in 2 parts, and then I glued them together and then covered them with wax. And I was trying to push myself in terms of making anatomically correct figures, making large-scale figures, not just having pieces that were standing upright. also, this other piece was kind of more of a return to how I had previously been building, kind of more of a statuesque, iconic um, imagery, and like trying to use Catholic imagery with like the, you know, the apple and Eve, and this worked. It's okay, but I was trying to go somewhere and I didn't exactly know where it was yet, but that's what graduate school is for. Ultimately, I settled on, instead of trying to make these big iconic sort of pieces that were symbolic in many different ways, that I should really try to focus on our dynamics in small moments, and like how if you go into a room or if you are hanging out with people, you can kind of read their body language. And so in my final year of graduate school, I was going and hiring models so that I could sculpt models in different poses and really rough, so that you just had an immediate read on like what is happening in a situation. So the piece on the couch, you know, it was like this guy in the middle has, you know, he's like taking up most of the space, and he is kind of, for me, he seems kind of like he's making other people uncomfortable. And then the other piece with the two people on the couch, you know, is talking about like, you know, when you have like a sort of a disagreement slash fight, but you're not really ready to make up yet. And maybe that person will turn around and like they'll become friends again, but maybe not. You can never tell. I call that piece "I'm Not Talking to You Right Now." So, and I also, you know, just wanted to celebrate the smaller moments. So that was in graduate school. You know, I went from making large life-size figures that were kind of stylized to smaller, more tactile, more like touchy pieces that you could tell that I was trying to make them really, really quick, to try to talk about the small little moments that happen in our day-to-day life. I enjoy this work, and I enjoyed the time that I spent studying and trying to make things really quick and immediate. My work now has kind of gone a little bit back to being a little bit more about, you know, investigating iconography and talking about different issues a little differently. Okay, so when I finished graduate school, I ended up staying in Nebraska for 2 years and working as an AmeriCorps volunteer. And I was staying there. I wasn't making much artwork. And that was 2012 and 2013. And in 2012 and 2013, there were two things that happened that didn't directly affect me, but were affected sort of how I looked at the world. And the first one was Hurricane Sandy came through New York and swept through the neighborhood that my grandmother had lived in and that I had gone to every summer growing, and destroyed it. It was destroyed by flood and also by fire. And so this is an image from the neighborhood that I lived in when I was a kid. Image on the left is an image from the neighborhood I grew up in as a kid. And it's a very Catholic community. And so there are a lot of Marys, and this is one that survived. And so this was like on the cover of the New York Times. And it was just such a weird, it was just a very strange feeling to know that some place that you loved was completely gone. And at the same time, Boston, which is where I grew up, there was the marathon bombing in Boston. And one of the, I never realized how you would, I guess I was surprised at how upset it made me, because I never ran in the Boston Marathon, but like the library that I went to every day after high school, you know, when I was studying for high school, was across the street from where this happened. And, you know, I grew up hanging out on that street. And so I just all of a sudden had these national events that were really pushing me, just kind of like just making me very upset. But also I had a personal relationship that ended, and I ended up moving away from Nebraska. I had to go back to Boston for a brief moment, and then I applied for and got a job teaching as at Gulf Coast State College in 2014, 2015. So in that time, I started making work where everything was kind of ominous. Like the yellow lady has this black ball that's like weighing down on the top of her head. And then the other person, what I want the color to indicate is like rising water. And so no one was very happy in my work because I had just gone through all this stuff where I just felt like that things were getting worse and worse. And unfortunately now we're kind of all feeling the same way, I think. But that there was a lot of paranoia and a lot of like sort of what I was trying to get across was like these two women who are standing are looking up at something that's coming at them that they can't control. And then the other one is people kind of conspiring with each other. And just in a way that, you know, it was just like a rough period of my life. But when you make art, you can make art and talk your way through it with your hands. So when I was at Gulf Coast State College, I was a teacher there, but I also was an artist in residence. At the end of the residency, you receive a show. And so this is images from the show that I had. So my work, after a year of making work that was somewhat about deception and feeling like there's something looming over you, I started making more work based on some research that I was doing. I was teaching an art appreciation class. And when we're talking about Northern Renaissance paintings, in those paintings, what was important was that a lot of times people are looking at things, where in like Italian Renaissance, there's architecture and there's less, it's more about perspective and more about the scene, whereas in Northern Renaissance, it was about like all the stuff that was there. So I started thinking about how do you make ceramic objects that are going from, you know, one is looking at another thing, or it's all about what is being looked at and what's being thought about. Additionally, because I lived in Florida, I lived in a house, I was house sitting, I lived in a house that had a pool, which I had never had before. Oh yeah, sorry, Gulf Coast State College is back in Florida. So I went back down to Florida. And I started having to like clean out the filter and stuff, and frogs would constantly be dying in that pool, and it was driving me bananas. Like I didn't, you know, I was trying to save them. So I just started thinking about how I was coming too late to save these frogs. And so it was like the frogs were far away, and it was about like how we're kind of powerless to prevent many things that happen in our lives. And just kind of the thought of like that, you know, at some point we have to kind of give up control and try to save the frogs, but it's not always going to work. Additionally, at this time, I was, my father had been diagnosed with dementia, I think a few years before this, but his dementia had started getting a lot worse. And so another thing that was happening while I was teaching at Gulf Coast was that I was getting these updates about, you know, his dementia worsening and worsening. And so my work from this point has started to talk a lot about memory and about sort of the loss of control that can happen that way. So this is just a portrait of an old man, but the flowers behind him are forget-me-nots. And the flowers is something that I later on repeated over and over, but they've changed. So I thought I would include this piece because when I was putting this talk together, I was like, oh, they have been with me for quite a while. Okay, so at the end of my time at Gulf Coast, I chaperoned, or I traveled with students to Greece, and I started looking at all this ancient work in person. This has really been what has now influenced my work for like the last 5 years. And so these two pieces, what I really enjoy about this kind of work is that they're fragments, and the piece with the smushed in head, there's a lot of work like that where you would see these statues that had been deliberately destroyed because one emperor dies or one leader dies, and then another leader comes up, and so they destroy all the other imagery of the old emperor, or in this case, the empress. And there was a lot of statues that you would look at and you would be like, wow, what a beautifully sculpted piece. And then you'd read the little placard and it would be like, this person, like I remember reading one that said, it was like a woman, but it was like, she was murdered by her husband, and because she was accused of poisoning his brother or something, and you're like, wow, she looks really nice. And so I started thinking about how the fragments that are left behind without research, we wouldn't necessarily know that she had been murdered by her husband, or we wouldn't necessarily know that the destruction of them was deliberate. Like sometimes things just happen. But if I started thinking how that's super fascinating to me, that what is left behind is the work that it's indicating that somebody was in power and that maybe they're no longer in power. And I mean, this has been more of a national conversation in the last couple of years, especially with like Confederate monuments. But the statuary that we leave behind, the art that we leave behind, can create a false narrative, and that has been very interesting to me. So this is where the residency was. It was like the most beautiful place I've ever been in my life. If you can ever go to Greece, you should definitely go there. It's in this place called Skopelos. It's an island. It's very beautiful. So then I moved to Appleton, Wisconsin. So completing my Boston, Florida, Midwest journey again. And I started teaching at Lawrence University, and I was bringing back some of those ideas, both from when I was in Florida and I was thinking about how to use the wall with a figurative component, and also stuff from Greece, like the Hamsa hand, which is like warding off the evil eye, or this other piece. It's, you know, it's a little hard to see in the image, but the woman has like a blue mouth, and then the hand, you know, when you lie and you cross your fingers. So that's what that hand is doing. So it's all about like, you know, what is this other thing telling us that we wouldn't necessarily know without kind of reading about the other, or looking at the other parts of what's hanging around it. And then, you know, I did a lot of exploration of still of color and of using things. At the same time, I was still thinking and dealing with the fact that my father had dementia. And so this piece with the yellow, the gold and then the black sort of growth on it was about, you know, we have so many gifts, and as we age, we lose them. And so there was moments where most of what he knew was gone, but that there were still some gold spots of like, he would remember certain things, or, you know, he would lose words. And so it was about the, you know, what can come out of our mouth and how we don't always, we can't always control what we're saying. And we think that we'll always be in control, but I have found that that is not true. This is just a self-portrait I did, so I thought I'd put it in there from, I think it was a self-portrait, and I was like 39, 38. And then again, I'm still thinking about how do people relate to each other, and how do we influence each other. And so like how, you know, in this, the figure in the bottom looks kind of uncomfortable, and the figure on top seems pretty placid about it. And so this is a very small piece, and just like an exploration of still kind of thinking about how we can mesh things together. So I wanted to show this piece. This was from a show at the University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh. And I'm using the flowers again, but they've kind of started to change this piece. And also the use of color in this piece. If you notice, the flowers go from blue, like they actually are, up, and they start getting black and white in terms of like how they're starting to lose their vitality. And again, it was a piece about memory loss, and about how it's inevitable that things will change and die over time. In 2017, I went to Rome for residency, and I went there because I wanted to look again at all of the older work that I was so interested in Greece. And when I was there, at the end of it is a 4-week residency. It's pretty short, and you have to have a show at the end. And so I made a couple of figurative pieces, but I was basing these entirely on works that I saw while I was there. And so one's Medusa, and then one is a Flavian lady. And because there's such a quick turnaround, these were pretty rough. So I later came back and I started working with these some more. I also did a series of drawings of tile on tiles, which I've done a lot, but I don't always show that part of my work. But I really love this clay body, and later drawing has become more of a component in my work. So then these are tiles that I later developed after I came back from Rome. Same idea, but just a little bit more developed, and a little bit with more color and more gloss to them. I also, in 2018, I was able to go to Japan. I've been trying to travel as much as possible, or I had been until COVID. So I went to Japan and I did a residency there, some images from a shrine and from the statues are covered in the red bibs, and the hats are for, I believe they're to protect the statues, but I think there's there's something with the idea of miscarriage, and that women will make these hats in order to help protect their unborn babies who they've miscarried. And so then this is just where the residency was, and that was the studio. That's me. It was incredibly hot there. It was like it was literally the hottest place on earth while I was there. So firing the kiln was super unpleasant, but it was a very lovely place to go. And this is the work I made. When I went there, I wanted to make work that was completely different from my normal work. I didn't want to do figuration while I was there, just to challenge myself. So I made Hanawa houses, and then I made these archways, which were based on this circular piece down below. There was a historic pottery village, and they used to put their pots would be fired on them. And so they were just leftover pieces, and they were used in like roadways and walls in this town in Tokonoma. So, and then the imagery that I would use on the archways were from temple doors. There are really beautiful designs on the hinges. Okay, so all of that traveling, all that work, I had a solo show at Lawrence University, and I decided to I used the show to explore these ideas further, the ideas of how we can make up stories, we can manipulate what people believe through the use of artwork, and that we can that the narratives that we think might be set in stone aren't necessarily set in stone. So I decided to make all these figures and give them fake names, essentially. And I decided to kind of make a lot of fragments of things for the show. This foot is like 3 feet or 4 feet long, and it's based on my own foot. It's also based on the bust of Constantine that is in Rome. So I did the hand, the bust, and the foot of Constantine that are well known. And then I also made fragments on the wall, and all of them were labeled so that they would appear as if they actually were from ancient times. I wanted to use only female figures, or I only use female figures, and I basically used myself, but I wanted to create this sort of fake past. At the same time that I was making this show, Brett Kavanaugh was being brought into the Supreme Court, and I started thinking about sort of the feeling that how power is given from one person to another, and how different systems will perpetuate themselves, but that also that somebody's truth isn't somebody else's truth, and that we'll never really know what's in the past. So I was just making a fake past in which I was just all of the icons, and I was creating just a very like a false background. I was basing a lot of these pieces on works that I saw when I was in Rome, and there's those flowers again. And so this one was called, it was like Saint Dymphna, and she is a saint who's known for being the saint of those who have mental illness. This piece was called Bust of an Unknown Lady, possibly Octavia. And I'm trying to like chisel away at the bottom so it appears as if it's older than it is. I made 2 pieces based on this one head, and both of them have names like Unknown Icon 2, Unknown Icon 3. This was a bust of Medusa based on Bernini's, I think it's Bernini's bust. And I had read that Bernini had based his Medusa on a woman who had broken his heart, and so he made her into this monster. So I decided to make myself into this monster. Also, the myth of Medusa is being reconsidered. You know, why did she become the woman that she is, it's because she was raped in a temple and then was cursed. So not really her fault. I also decided that I would make myself into a holy relic. And so I cast my finger in glass, and then I built a little reliquary, and then I sewed that pillow. My sewing skills are not great, but it was the finger of Catherine of somewhere, I can't remember where, but yeah, so that's my actual finger. And then these are just little busts of heads that I was making as I was working, and they're small, like less than 8 inches each, 8 to 9 inches. And it's just, again, I'm trying to figure out how to age pieces. So the head on the right has a lot of texture on the bottom. The head on the left is cut off as if it's been broken. Another piece that I made, it's based on what's called a Herm sculpture from Italy. And that's where one sculpture, it's like usually after someone's death, I believe. And there's 2 sides to them. And so sometimes there are 2 different people. I like to think it's 2 different personalities. I just really enjoyed making this piece. Again, I'm trying to figure out how to make things so that they look aged. And then these were more recent pieces where I, again, was just trying to figure out different types of ways to cut off figures and ways to make kind of ancient looking head crowns. So in 2020, as we all know, there was COVID, and I haven't made too much work in 2020. Usually I work during the summers, and this summer I wasn't able to. I went back to Boston to help take care of my father, who then passed away this summer. But before I left, I made this harpy, and I was looking into mythology about harpies, and in my mind, harpies are supposed to be really vicious and they have talons. But I had seen this sculpture of this harpy in Greece, 5-6 years ago, and she had the feet of a duck, and she looked real nice. And so I just thought that there's a lot of people who are afraid of women and kind of have this view of women as being dangerous. I think, especially in the soon to be former administration, that the view of women kind of can go wildly from, that we're these horrible harpies who are out to get you, or we're victims and we need to be protected. And so I thought I would just make myself a little harpy. And I don't think that this is my most successful piece ever. I ended up giving it to some friends, but I include it because it's really one of the only pieces I made in 2020. I also made this Antifix, and an Antifix in Rome was used on the side of a building, and it was a protective figure. And so I found that with 2020 and all the things that were happening in 2020, that I was like, maybe we need some protective figures on our houses. Maybe we need to put out some protection all over our world. And so I decided to make myself one. And so far it's been working. So thank you so much for coming to my talk. If you want to email me, it's MeghanSullivanCeramics@gmail. My Instagram is MeghanSullivanCRMX, and that's my website. I can answer any questions if anyone has any.
What are you going to do next?
That's a really good question. My work really got interrupted this summer, and since I've been back, I was teaching, and with COVID, teaching was a little different than usual. But I've been really kind of struggling with what to make next, and I actually am starting to do some testing to change my glazes. I don't know if you can tell, but a lot of the glazes I've been using are really dry, and I just feel like maybe I just need juicier glazes, and that will then change how what kind of work I'm doing. I also have started to think that I want to try to get back to more fuller figures, more than just heads. It seems a little I'm not quite as happy with just making heads. I was this fall I was making urns for my dad, but and then I made a piece that's kind of about that, but it's not done yet. So I I don't know. I mean, it's really, it's a little scary in my studio right now because I'm not really sure what exactly I'm doing, which is a good thing. As long, you know, I just don't want to go back and doing the same thing over and over.
I wanted to know what your most inspirational or influential place that you visited was for your work.
That's a good question. Well, when I went to Greece, it was really like the most beautiful place I've ever been. And I was amazed by that. And I think that I hadn't traveled in a really long time because I was in grad school and super, super poor. So it was like the first time I was able to travel and enjoy where I was. And I would think that, I mean, I think that's really pushed me for the last 5 years. Traveling to Japan was also really great. But it didn't really change my artwork as much as I think traveling to Greece did. So if you can ever travel to Greece, you should totally go there.
Do you have any plans or hopes for future projects?
Well, I have a piece. That's a good question, Chelsea. I have a commission for so I didn't show this, but with the flowers, I did a commission for the Hilton, the Monona Terrace Hilton in Madison, 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. It's really hard to tell what time has passed recently. And so it's behind like the reception desk, and it's this big flower piece that kind of goes up and around, and it's on my website. And I'm going to make a similar piece to that for actually the Lawrence University Library. But that's part of why I'm trying to change up my glazes, because I thought like the piece works, but I just want to see how else I can push it forward. So that's like the big thing that I'm working on right now, is just testing and seeing what I should change and what I should keep. And I kind of want to I've been thinking I want to make a piece that has something to do with masking, but I haven't gotten there yet.
You had talked with one of your earlier pieces. You mentioned that you had used wax on it. Can you tell me a little bit about how that worked, and why you maybe changed to drier glazes? And
yeah, well, so I'm kind of a ceramic traditionalist, but when I was in graduate school, I was trying to be more free and open. And then I said no more of that. But it's it's like beeswax and paraffin. It's like encaustic. So it's beeswax, paraffin, and then an oil paint, and you can tint the color that way. With the large figurative piece that I made that had wax on it, part of it was I wanted it to feel really raw. It's a little hard to see in that image, but one figure is really trying to pull away from the other, and one is asleep and unaware of the other one's distress. And so I really wanted to feel like very visceral and kind of gross. But it also had to do with the fact that because the pieces had to be fired separately and joined together, it was practical consideration in that it would mask the joint, but also it was like what I wanted the piece to feel really uncomfortable. But then I realized that I really love ceramic glazing, and I like that you can get a lot of different effects with glaze, and that with glaze it's almost like it is part of the piece, whereas with the encaustic with wax, or even with like cold surfacing, like painting, that it feels very surface to me. And so I like the things to be enmeshed together. It's not always the smartest way to do things either. So I do manage to make my life more difficult than maybe I need to, but that's what we do. So.
So the time when you were working looser, making the small figurines showing body language, how did that experience of working really loose and fast affect your later work, or did you continue that? Or
I think that it helped me. If I was kind of belaboring work a lot, and it helped me be more immediate. And I actually feel like I want to get back a little bit back to that immediacy. It also did change my way of building. I was building a solid clay, and it just allowed me to understand that you can keep it tactile. In ceramics, there was a lot of like super smooth, super perfect kind of like figuration, and mine was, I just didn't want that. And having to work with a model, I learned very quickly more about anatomy, and I was able to kind of, I had a grad school professor who'd always say, like, there's that what's the uncanny valley with, like, where something is figurative or it looks like a human, but it's like kind of gross, like it's too human. And then there's things that we can get away with. So a lot of those figures, because it's loose, it's like things are implied, but we will accept that that is it. It will read correctly. And so it's kind of like, how much can I get away with and have things read correctly without being 100% accurate, like cast off of, like literally cast from a person.
Yeah.
And then you also can then get into like a little bit of like not being grotesque, but like allowing yourself to exaggerate certain aspects, which we all naturally do when we sculpt figures. Things definitely get sort of altered based on our own perceptions. So yeah, I think it just helped kind of, if you're in a rut, you should work really fast for a little while, and then you'll kind of figure out where you're going.
So I have a question that's kind of specific to me, but also probably relevant to Lauren's students eventually. So as a recent graduate, I'm just kind of wondering what you did in times where you weren't necessarily in a residency or in grad school. How did you kind of have the discipline or like inspire yourself to keep making art, even though you weren't necessarily in some kind of full-time art position?
It's really hard. Yeah, I remember, so when I first graduated from undergrad, I moved home, and then I got a job as a production potter. So I was working 40 hours a week pouring pots, and I think I made one really terrible piece for myself that year. It was really bad. It was like, I made it in my parents' basement, and then I don't even know how I transported it to a kiln. It can be really hard to, even in a residency or at a teaching position, it can be hard to get your time. It's, I don't know, I can only tell you it's hard. But there have been times where I have been really productive, and there have been times where I have been unable to make work for whatever reason, or that I've been distracted by other things, or I've been interested in other projects that are not art related. And at the moment, I would really beat myself up over not getting work done and not making enough. But you can't, you will continue to, like, you'll ebb and flow, and that's okay. When I finished undergrad, or the year before I graduated undergrad, there was an artist who came and talked at the graduation, and they said, get into your studio every day. And I just felt like, at the time I was like, yeah, that's right. And then when you can't get in your studio every day because you have other life stuff, that's okay. You just have to get into your studio, how about we say once a week, or get into your sketchbook once a week, or be creative somehow. And, everything kind of comes together. I realized a few years ago when I was talking to a student at Lawrence about like what I've done and where I'm going, I was like, I was so hard on myself unnecessarily, and there's no reason for you to be like that. You should, you should just be okay with what you're making and what you're doing. And if you're really, sometimes you'll go down a path with your art that doesn't really pay off, or you feel like it doesn't pay off, but then it will. So even the moments where you're like just sketching and not making like big things, it does kind of come back, and it will work out. I think. I mean, and this is me saying like, I don't know what's happening in my studio right now. And like 2020 was really bad for my production of anything. So it's also a really terrible year to try to make anything. We're all a little distracted. Thank you all for coming.